So you've been spending quite a bit of time with CSS in your life, right? So what would you say are the kind of a common gotchas of things you wish you'd understood earlier? Because I remember vividly trying to make sense of all the Internet Explorer hacks and understand how floating works and all of that. Are there anything that you wish you understood earlier, let's say in Grid or Flexbox or anything layout related?
Well, when I first started out was pretty early on, and I wasn't really serious about it. And so how I worked in the past was I just copied and pasted other people's code, and it just magically worked, and I really didn't think much about it. So at the time, I think it was like 2008-ish, it was still HTML tables. You'd be surprised. But there were a lot of HTML tables. If I look back at my very, very early projects, they were no longer online, so don't try looking for them. And when I actually got a proper job doing it, that was 2013. So by then, Flexbox had been released. I had heard of it, never touched it. It was still like all floats all day, every day. And wrangling floats was pretty challenging for someone who was kind of just starting out, because I hadn't realized that you ought to have gone to the spec to figure out how these things work. I just ended up Googling a lot of tutorials, and sometimes the tutorials weren't correct. Sometimes there's conflicting information. So one of the things I wished I realized early on was that refer back to the spec. I understand that the earlier specs might be written in a fairly more hard to understand manner, but like the newer ones, the ones for Flexbox, the ones for Grid, they're written in such a way that they are lengthy, but they're very well illustrated, and it almost flows like a narrative, which makes it so much more easier than if you refer to the earlier like CSS2, where it's really targeted just at browser implementers, so they didn't really bother to make it read very smoothly as long as the implementers understood it. But it's like going back to the source, right? I feel that sometimes when we start off and then we Google and we encounter like Stack Overflow answers or tutorials, it sometimes plays like a game of Chinese whispers where the information has sort of transited over the course of numerous blog posts, and sometimes some things get misinterpreted, and that makes it really confusing for people starting out. So for myself, after I spent more time actually building layouts and then discovering that it made most sense to go back to the spec, I was actually able to sort of filter out which tutorials I knew like were either outdated or the techniques that they were recommending weren't really best practice, but I didn't realize that until I had gone back to the spec. So I guess, long story short, I think it would have been really helpful if I had learned to read the spec much earlier on.
Yeah, but everybody is a little bit afraid of a spec. I mean, like all this text and so many characters and no funny pictures and all. When it comes to new specifications, people are very often, at least this is my experience, people are very often a little bit, kind of pausing and putting things on hold just because, it's not support everywhere. And every now and again, you'll see articles about CSS Grid published today, where you still see a comment of somebody posting, oh, but, it doesn't work in that Explorer, so I can't really use it. So what would you respond to these people?
Well, first of all, I don't blame them, because that is a mindset that was fairly justified even as recent as I'd say like 5 years ago, because browsers at the time didn't push out features and bug fixes as frequently as they do now. And I think especially web developers who started out, especially like 7, 8 years ago, it's a bit hard to change your mindset to sort of accept that browsers are being updated fairly frequently and they are doing auto updates, right? Because in the past, you had to bank on your audience, like maybe they'll click the update button, so that's like a gamble. It's like Russian roulette, so you want to be more conservative. But I think now in this day and age, it's 2019. It's fairly safe. I mean, there's no 100% guarantee that you're gonna get users who are not on IE6, but that percentage is really very low, and I think there are also more techniques for developers to cater to a variety of browsers, not just it's very different from the past where you had Netscape focus styles and IE focus styles. No, it's a different way of dealing with it, with feature queries and other fallbacks. And I think that for people who insist that they can't because their users are still on IE9, I guess my first thing is that because there are legitimate use cases and businesses like banks maybe where internal systems are still on legacy IE9, right? And but to be fair, I don't think that's all that common. So if you're on a legacy system like IE9, I'll tell you something different. But if you're just like an average front end developer, I'll pull stats, the statistics. The last I checked, I think almost 93% of internet users are using a browser that supports Grid. For Flexbox, it's even higher. It's like more than 97%. Also talking about things like feature queries that allow you to sort of ensure that your layout will never be broken, regardless of the type of browser your user is using. Now, it will not look the same. And I think that's the bigger argument to make, to convince people that the web is such a dynamic medium that it really doesn't make sense. It's in fact very limiting to expect your browsers to look the same on every browser, because people view your stuff on different devices. Devices have different screen sizes. Now there's even like handhelds and watches. So it's totally not. It's so limiting to insist that your layout looks exactly the same on every device. Instead, we should sort of embrace the fact that the web is such a fantastic medium because your layout, your single code base can actually adapt to all these different screen sizes. You don't have to say, oh, I need one specific layout for a watch, and then one for a phone, and then one for a bigger phone, and then one for... No, you can actually do that with one single code base. And I think that's something that's amazing. To me, the line, it's a feature, not a bug, is actually real in this case. It's not a joke, it's real.
Yeah, of course, makes sense. Yeah, because in the end, when it comes to establishing some sort of profound principles like progressive enhancement, let's say semantic HTML, accessible content, and all by default, that makes it then easier to provide a slightly different experience to A6 or IE9 at this point without having to worry too much. But then it still brings up a question that needs to be answered. And I guess that many developers who will be listening to this later, or be watching this later, they'll be asking themselves, so, okay, now if I want to actively support IE9 or IE11, which you probably want to do, I'll probably have to either polyfill grid layout, or I mean, kind of rewrite, let's say, the grid property that we're writing usually for 11, or I'll have to build, let's say, with positioning, with floats from the start, maybe Flexbox from the start. So from a technical perspective, would you say that you always suggest to build grid first, with the fallback being then Flexbox, I guess? Or would you say we build Flexbox first and then we enhance with grid?
That's the case that I mentioned earlier, where you're in an enterprise, a legacy enterprise, a bank that insists that your developers, sorry, we have to use IE9 for security reasons, which is such a terrible argument. But let's assume that that's the situation you're in. I think to be safe, you'd wanna, and this would differ again depending on the design that your design team is coming up with, which is so. I feel that it's actually imperative for the designer and the developer to actually work together on this, because you can't have, unless your designer are themselves very, very familiar with how browser layouts work, they might not be able to produce a design that can be built most efficiently. So let's assume that you're working together. If you have to support a legacy browser that goes back as far as IE9, I would suggest starting off with the legacy techniques first. So you start off with as basic styles as you can possibly get, those that you know are going to be supported regardless. So your display blocks, your floats, your inline blocks, because I think you can actually do a lot with those. It's just not as, I would say, not as convenient as the newer techniques. So I think the way of structuring the CSS would be that, it's not, okay, unfortunately is the wrong thing, is that you do have to have a very clear understanding of what the layout properties do and how to reset them when you're doing the fallbacks, when you're doing the enhancements. Because if you're going to use something like feature queries, there is a matrix. I call it a matrix because the older browsers don't actually support feature queries at all. So what's going to happen is that for those browsers, the entire block of CSS that you write within your feature query is ignored completely. And that might not be a bad thing, because if that entire block is ignored, that means you don't even have to override. You can keep the base styles, which is why I suggest doing the base styles first, because then your base styles are essentially a default. Then you would have to put a bit more thought into the resets when it comes to the actual code inside the feature queries. And for that, that's where I say that a clear understanding of how the CSS properties work and how the browser resolves these values. So you do need a clear understanding of inheritance rules, how the cascade works. And that's a good thing, because if you've never done something like this before and you're worried that you won't be able to do it, I think it's a good opportunity for people to attempt this, and then when you come out of it, you're definitely going to have a much stronger understanding of how CSS works, and it's definitely going to benefit you for future projects. So yeah, my approach is to start with the legacy CSS properties first, and then build on top of that. Mm-hmm. And it is more effort to do it that way, but it's that learning that you get from doing it that way is invaluable. I don't see a downside to that other than an additional effort and time.
Right. I also see a couple of companies actually using grid layout, kind of going grid layout first when it comes to prototyping. They prototype very, very quickly, and designers would kind of come on board, and they would prototype very, very quickly with grid layout first. And then, of course, when you need to kind of support all the browsers, you will be looking into the ways of making it work there. And in fact, actually, when you look into the scenarios and maybe tooling, because I heard that you will be speaking about the tooling and the state of tooling when it comes to CSS layouts, can you maybe shed a bit of light into where we stand in terms of tools let's say, for debugging CSS layouts? Believe this is going to be the point of your talk, right?
Well, at this point in time, I strongly believe that if you're going to do a lot of work with CSS layouts, your go-to browser and corresponding dev tools will be Firefox, because Mozilla has really put in a lot of effort and work over the past 2 and 3 years to really develop their developer tools, especially for people doing a lot of web design work. So they have the best layout. They have the best layout tools at the moment. They have one of the best CSS inspector tools. They're the only browser with a Flexbox inspector at this point in time. They also recently shipped the Shapes inspector with support for CSS shapes, fonts, and so on. So I feel that as a front-end developer, you would have naturally at least 8 browsers installed on your computer. It's not just me, right? Like everybody has at least 8. So it's since we're testing in so many different browsers anyway, odds are you probably have a copy of Firefox. And I would actually go for the nightly edition. And so it even has support for Subgrid. So we might talk about Subgrid a little bit later, but Firefox Nightly, to me, is the go-to debugging and building tool for CSS layouts. I mean, even Chrome has a very rudimentary grid inspector, but all it shows you are the grid lines. And that is helpful, but you can do so much more with the Firefox DevTools at this point in time. So hopefully the other browsers can try to catch up, hopefully. Yeah, but for now, it's Firefox Nightly for me. That's my recommendation.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned CSS Grid. Oh, actually, CSS Subgrid, sorry. So when is it going to happen? Is it on the agenda? Is it available already? It will be available tomorrow. Tell us.
So Subgrid is, if you checked, can I use right now, at this point in time when we're having this conversation, is going to be supported in Firefox 69 onwards. Which means if you are using you're using Nightly right now, it is in there, it's turned on. For everyone else, there hasn't been much news. There is a Chromium bug that's been filed for a couple of years since Grid was released, but there hasn't been much movement on that particular issue. I kind of keep track of the browser issues. I like just to have a look-see of what's going on. So no news from the Google side yet. Definitely going to be out in stable when Firefox 69 is out. The stable edition in, I think, a couple months, because right now I'm not sure what the stable edition is. Definitely in 69, so that's confirmed. Safari is, very Safari-ish. And so because Microsoft Edge has now moved to the Chromium engine, treat Microsoft Edge and Chrome as on the same release schedule for features. So I think for those two browsers, not much news yet, but I think there has been a lot of feedback that people do want this. So it's really dependent on Google's own internal roadmap, but 100% sure that at least Firefox will be fully supporting it in the coming months.
So maybe it would be a good idea to just quickly remind our listeners, or people who are going to watch it later, what subgrid is and how it's helpful.
So Grid, just a brief recap, is actually a layout model that allows developers to define grid rows and columns. So it's very good for people who want to do two-dimensional layouts where your grids and rows have a relationship with each other. It is currently the only layout model in CSS that allows you to do this. Now, when Grid first came out, subgrid, which was a feature that was originally in the first level, it was a bit complex, and the implementers and spec authors wanted to give it a bit more time to develop so that this would be a more robust feature. So it got deferred. It got deferred to level 2. And what it does is that it allows nested grids to sort of take up the sizing of their parent grid. So when Grid first came out, the grid items were only how should I put this? When you apply display grid on a parent item, only its direct children become grid items and participate in this defined grid. So anything like any further level of nesting won't be able to participate in the parent grid. But with subgrid, what this feature allows is for all your nested grids to participate in the sizing of their parent grids, which makes it much easier for you to have nested components. I think a very, very common use case that people say is that, I want to keep my markup semantic, especially if you have things like lists, which require a UL or an OL and then list items within it. You'd want this list to participate in the bigger grid. But without subgrid, you couldn't do that without either flattening the markup, which is actually not a good idea at all. People don't recommend you doing this. Or you'd have to sort of do a rather complicated calculation to make sure that your inner grid match the width of your outer grid. It makes it so much easier to just say that, to tell the browser, I'm just going to say this in plain English, is that, hey, browser, please make this inner grid follow the sizing of the parent grid. You just do a display subgrid, and then it just works. So that's the big advantage of having subgrid.
Yeah, and it also opens up many possibilities for all kind of creative layouts. And this is what we've been seeing for the last maybe year or so, where we see a lot of really interesting art-directed layouts, quite dynamic grids and all coming up. But it also opens up another question that's probably going to be the final one. We could speak just for hours, but we have limited time here. So how do you see the evolution of CSS layouts in the next years to come? So for a couple of years, we've been having conversations about CSS shapes and regions and kind of things flowing in from one area to another. We do have CSS grid now. We probably will have CSS subgrid. Well, no, CSS grid subgrid, I guess. Oh, just subgrid by the end of the year as well.
Yeah.
And so, how do you see the, let's say, not just the tooling, but the state of CSS layout as it moves forward? Like, where will we be, let's say, 2 years from now? Or where would you like to be 2 years from now?
Yeah, I mean, we can't predict the future, but I've been very, very fortunate to have gotten to know people who work in the CSS working group, people like Rachel Andrew, Jen Simmons, Elika Atamat, and the way, like, through just casual chats with them, I realized how much the way CSS is developed has evolved. You know, it's not like CSS is this dusty old organization where they mandate that, oh yeah, this must be how the CSS. No, they are also they're also evolving their processes. They're taking in feedback. My favorite example to refer to is the way Flexbox was rolled out and the way Grid was rolled out, right? When Flexbox was rolled out, I think a lot of like browser vendors were doing their own thing. So then you ended up having like to support multiple syntaxes. It was very messy. That's why if you just refer to like an auto prefixed version of Fluxbox code, it's like a whole churn of a whole different set of like vendor prefixes. But when they tried to do Grid, when they tried to experiment with Grid, they did the flag. They hid it behind a flag so that they could still garner feedback from developers, but really deter them from using it in production. I think the problem with that earlier implementation of Flexbox was that people used it in production before it was ready, and the rule of the web, which I find interesting, that almost no other software I know of, is that the rule of the web is that you cannot break the internet, you cannot break the web, and that's the unique position that browser implementers are in. So if a significant proportion of the code out in the wild are using an unready syntax, they still have to support it anyway. So then they came up with this flag idea, which I think worked really great for CSS Grid. And it also allowed a lot of the browser vendors to sort of coordinate a rollout, which was amazing because Grid actually came out in the span of a month by the 4 major browser vendors. So Mozilla, Chrome, even Safari, like rolled it out all within the span of a month. And I think there's also more people coming out to encourage the average developer to sort of be more participative in this entire process. People like Rachel Andrew are one of the biggest advocates for developers to sort of provide feedback, because all of the specification work is done in the open. It's all open source. You can see everything that's going on GitHub. The meeting minutes, they're available online, the IRC logs, and they're tracked in GitHub issues. So I think it's as more people realize that this is a thing, that they realize that, hey, this is kind of like an open source project, not really, but it is open source, to be more participative in the entire process, so that it's a positive feedback loop, right? Because if developers like you and I, we don't use features, or we don't try out features because we're like, oh no, it's not going to be supported, then the people who implement the features or are thinking, because it's like, if you look at the CSS, the index, there's like 500 properties, and in fact there are more as browser vendors and people start to talk about, like, oh, I wish the browser could do this, oh, I wish this other feature was there. But to have actual feedback, to have people say, hey, spec authors, have you thought about this, and actually craft out a nice use case in black and white, rather than just a random tweet even though a random tweet on the web probably works, it's much better if people put in a little bit more effort to describe the problem and then have discussions. And I think I see this as a very, very positive trend that hopefully will pick up. And so when I say, when you bringing back to your original question of how do I see CSS developing, layouts are developing, I think that with people like Rachel Andrew, who are really picking up specs and pushing them forward, talking about them, writing about them, like, I for sure know that Rachel Andrew is a big proponent for regions, but regions do need a lot of work because of how complex it is. She's also pushing forward multi-call, so she's trying to develop the spec even further. And at the same time she's doing this, she's trying to get more people to be aware of this entire feedback process, and hopefully it will become a much more robust implementation when it does come out, when browser vendors do implement it, because there is a benefit in having more people and more perspectives and more use cases fleshed out earlier in the process, as opposed to when browser vendors actually implement it and then people start complaining like, oh, actually, we didn't really want this thing. But so to move this feedback much earlier into the development process, I feel that it can only benefit the community as a whole. I hope that this is the direction that CSS will continue to develop and how specifications and features get implemented in the years to come.
Excellent.
We'll fix it in post.
Yes, yeah. Right, so maybe then there's the final one, because I'm really curious, to be honest. So, dear Huijing, tell me, what are you most excited in CSS these days? Like, if you had to pick just one single feature, just one single thing that's you just really want to see, you just want to do, or you want to spend your entire life with, what would it be?
Well, it's not a specific feature per se, but it's the fact that like I discovered this like about a year or two ago when I first was playing around with Flexbox and Grid. The fact that we can now have, and there's no good term for this, I call it variable rate of change, which is like, because the new sizing functions that Grid and how Flexbox, how the browser resolves Flexbox values. So if you use different sizing functions, for example, if you use min-max with FR, with auto, you are able to have your elements, your containers, change their size at different rates. And I find that very fascinating, because when we used to use percentages for like 20 years, everyone used percentages. And when you change the browser size, it all changed at the same rate. It was a constant rate of change. You grew at the same rate and you shrunk at the same rate. And that was very limiting. But now, with this ability for the columns to sort of wait for each other to grow and shrink, that opens up so many more possibilities in terms of design, in terms of responsive design. And I haven't even finished like thinking through all the possible layouts that can happen. Like you can do like overlap. You can make the interplay between images and text, which clearly one has a ratio and one does not, that you can actually make these work together in greater harmony than you ever could before, because of the possibilities that layout models like Grid and Flexbox offer. They offer overlap. They offer you the ability to change your size at a different rate. Because personally, I find layout, whether it is on a digital medium or on a static print medium, that's a thing that excites me. That's something that interests me in general. And so to be able to play with layout dynamically, that to me, I think I could do that for the longest time. And as more features come out, and then it's just like giving me more things to play with. So yeah, that's what I find most appealing, the dynamism of our canvas when we do design.
Oh, that's everybody likes to play with CSS, I guess. All right, Huijing, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Looking forward to hear you speaking at ViewSource in September 30th and October 1st. One of those days for sure, I guess.
Yeah.
And
excited.
Also looking forward to see you again. Thanks everyone for joining as well, and I'm looking forward to the next one. Thanks you, Huijing. Bye bye.
Thanks, Billy. See you.